Steve Andreas, Six Blind Elephants. Page 223. Chapter 11. Significance. Beyond indication and logic. It is not the things in themselves which trouble us, but the opinions we have about these things. Epictetus, 1st century BC. Indication in chapter 3. Indication. In chapter 3 we explored how a word identifies, indicates or points to an experience, what something is. That is a book of matches. We can do this because of our ability to categorize events and name them. And then we prototype example from the category to represent the meaning of the whole category. Most people have no trouble agreeing on these more or less objective kind of meaning. Yes, that's a book of matches. Logic and mathematics is a way of determining if certain conclusions are valid, assuming that certain categorical propositions or axioms are true. The basic structure of logic is the if-then linkage, and the uncertainty expressed in the if is a very important one. If X is true, then Y is true. If there is book of matches, and if matches can be used to start a fire, then this book of matches can be used to start a fire. Logic is a set of rules and procedures for determining whether arguments reach meaningful conclusions, and the meaning is restricted to true or false. Logic can only say, if this is true, then that is true or false. Although logic is incredibly useful, it is basically a way to determine the internal consistency of thinking, so that if our assumptions are true, we can use logic to reach correct conclusions. Logic can be thought of as a way of making sure that meaning doesn't get lost, and that false meanings don't get created during the course of a train of thought or discussion. Given a set of numbers and procedures for processing those numbers, a computer can use its logic circuits to give a correct numerical answer. However, a computer can't determine how the original numbers were derived, whether they actually measure what they are supposed to measure, or if the results of the computation have any relevance to real world. Logic has no way to determine whether a word indicates an appropriate category of events, or whether the propositions relating different categories are true. That can only be established by experience or careful scientific experimentation. Significance is a different kind of meaning. Indication simply identifies an event as belonging to a category. For instance, book of matches. The next step is to determine the subjective relevance of the categorization for me in the present context. What does this book of matches mean to me? What is the significance of this event or category of events in terms of my history, needs, wishes, desired outcomes, etc.? Significance is something that we attribute to events and behaviors by linkages that we make in our minds. Processes like this often become clearer when they don't work than when they do, because they reveal a missing element that would otherwise go unrecognized. Below is a fascinating example of how the significance of a category of behavior can differ even when the indication and logic are agreed upon. During the last years of World War II and the early post-war years, hundreds of thousands of United States soldiers were stationed in or passed through Great Britain, providing a unique opportunity to study the effects of a large-scale penetration of one culture by another. One interesting aspect was a comparison of courtship patterns. Both American soldiers and British girls accused one another of being sexually brash. Investigation of this curious double charge brought to light an interesting punctuation problem. In both cultures, courtship behavior from the first eye contact to the ultimate consummation went through approximately 3 steps, but the sequence of these steps was different. Kissing, for instance, comes relatively early in the North American pattern, occupying, let's say, step 5, and relatively late in the English pattern, step 25, let's assume, where it is considered highly erotic behavior. So, when United States soldiers somehow felt that the time was right for a harmless kiss, not only did the girl feel cheated out of 20 steps of what for her would have been proper behavior on this part, she also felt she had to make a quick decision: break off the relationship and run, or get ready for intercourse. If she chose the latter, the soldier was confronted with behavior that, according to his cultural rules, could only be called shameless at this early stage of the relationship. Since our process of attending to a scope, categorizing it, and finding meaning is usually so fast that it is entirely unconscious, I want to use simple scenario to illustrate the kinds of shifts that can occur in the significance of a book of matches. I walk into the kitchen one morning, and my eyes are drawn to a book of matches lying on the table. No one in our family smokes, and we keep matches in a drawer because we usually only use them to light candles on holidays, or if the power goes out. In the context of this knowledge, the meaning of this book of matches is only that it is a small puzzle, and I feel curious. Then I think, oh, someone in the family took them out. And I imagine one of my sons using a match to sterilize a needle in order to remove a splinter. This enlarges the scope of my experience of the matches to include an image of my son, using them previous evening. Now the meaning is that it is a small bit of disorder, and I feel a tiny bit of annoyance that he didn't put them away when he was done. At this point, my categorization of the matches is that someone I care for has left them out, and I want them to be back in the drawer. I no longer feel puzzled and curious, but more settled in my new understanding. As I pick up the matches to put them back in the drawer, I notice that they advertise a store I don't know. So they aren't our matches. And I think someone else must have brought them into the house and left them here. This changes my scope to a different one. The image of my son removing a splinter vanishes, and in its place I get a ghostly image of an undefined, faceless person moving through our kitchen with the matches, and hear their footsteps. Now the meaning of the matches is again an unsolved puzzle, but now I have a feeling of mild concern about this unknown person. Who was this person? What were they doing in the house? And why did they leave the matches here? If you were in my position, what might you experience next as you attempt to determine the significance of the Book of Matches? What images, sounds, or feelings might change the scope of experience in your mind? How might you categorize them, and what significance would they have for you? The structure of significance. The meaning of any experience is partially dependent on the content of what is experienced, and that aspect is usually fairly obvious. However, the structure of meaning is much less obvious, and it is independent of the content that is represented. For instance, let's say that I come into my living room and see an older man and a younger woman, neither of whom I know. At this point, they have little or no meaning for me, other than the indicative meaning. They are both human beings, an older male and a younger female. Then my wife tells me that the woman brought the man and that he is her lawyer. Notice how that simple sentence expands the scope of your internal images, and how that creates at least the beginning of some meaning about how these people came to be in my living room. These scraps of meaning may have also elicited some questions about the significance of these facts. A lawyer? Are we being sued? Asked to be a witness? Or is there an inheritance? If I had seen these same two people on a street or in a restaurant, and my wife had told me the same information, I probably would have had a very different experience, perhaps wondering how my wife knew these people, or what it would be like to get to know them as friends. The woman bringing the man to the house is an example of what is cause-effect. The woman caused the man to be here. We can understand this by imagining a short movie or film strip of her bringing him here from somewhere else through a scope of space and time. The statement that the man is her lawyer is a statement about equivalence. Man equals lawyer. The man is a member of the category lawyers. Neither caused the other. One is a member of the other. Neither caused the other. One is a member of the other. He is a lawyer, irrespective of context. He is still a lawyer when he is mowing the lawn or sleeping. He can easily understand this meaning. Is using two still images next to each other, an image for the man and an adjacent image of lawyer in the same moment in time. The context is a third element that creates meaning. Seeing these two people in my living room is quite different than seeing them on the street or in a restaurant. The context creates a background that affects the meaning of the foreground, and this is also simultaneous. I see the foreground and background at the same time. Often the context is presupposed or ignored as we attend to events in the foreground. We create meaning by linking two or more experiences together in our minds, and we can do this sequentially in time, cause-effect, or simultaneously in space. Two experiences can be linked simultaneously in space, either by seeing them side by side, equivalence, or one inside the other, context. Let's consider these three structural possibilities in more details. Sequential meaning, cause-effect. X causes Y, or X goes to Y. When two experiences are linked in the mind sequentially, in a scope of time, a cause-effect linkage is created. His voice makes me feel afraid because of his reckless driving. He will get into an accident. Her touching me tenderly gives me goosebumps. Although causation always requires a sequence in time, sequence does not always imply causation. Two things could be unrelated even though one came before the other. Two birds sing just before dawn does not imply that the birds caused the dawn. In fact, the earlier indications of dawn caused the birds to sing. Whether or not cause-effect can be established or justified philosophically, it is a fundamental way that we understand events. It is also one of the fundamental elements in the success of the entire scientific enterprise. A cause-effect that has not been tested is called a superstition. It might or might not be true, We don't know until we have tested it to find out if it is valid or not. Simultaneous meaning. We can link two experiences simultaneously in space in two ways, either by putting two representations next to each other, equivalence, or by placing one inside the other, context. Equivalence. X is Y, or X equals Y. When two experiences are linked simultaneously, someone is likely to use words like is or means, which state or imply an equivalence between two scopes of experience. Often the linkage is between an external scope and an internal category. That look means he thinks I am a wimp. He's opening the door for me is an expression of caring. The internal representation is usually a prototype that represents a category rather than the entire category. When this is reversed, an equivalence is more like a definition. Equating a category to a prototype experience that represents the category. Security means not having to worry. A good job is one in which I know exactly what to do. In this case, the category typically comes first in the sentence, but it can be reversed. Pausing to watch a sunset is peace. When two scopes are linked in this way in our minds, it is usually a part-whole statement or other statement of inference. That meow means that the cat is in the house. Seeing tracks in the snow is a sign that a deer is nearby. When we link two categories with equivalence, the is becomes are. When we link two categories with equivalence, the link becomes are. Politicians are liars. Children are the future. Context. X in Y, or X surrounded by Y. The meaning of an automobile engine in a car is quite different from the meaning of the same engine in your living room. The meaning of an off-color joke is very different at a poker party than it is in church. The context that a scope is embedded in is a special cause of simultaneous meaning created by seeing one scope within a larger scope of space or time. Meaning results from the categorization of the relationship between the event and its context. And we typically respond more to the experience than we do to the context. For instance, when I described the automobile engine in your living room, the engine probably stood out in your image, while the living room was de-emphasized. This effect can be enhanced if we separate the two, so that the engine is seen nearer than surrounding scope of the living room, creating a foreground that is represented in front of a background context. While this is a familiar experience for most people, the reverse is not, as you can easily confirm by trying it in your mind. Instead of seeing the engine near, see it as farther, as if you were looking through a hole in the surroundings. When we do this, we attend more to the context, and the engine becomes less important. When someone makes a statement about the meaning created by context, often both the meaning and the context is presupposed, or even omitted entirely, and may even be completely unconscious. I am too quiet at business meetings, and that means I can't be successful. She's too aggressive at parties, and I don't like that. He's too cheerful at sad occasions. He's weird. There is an old Taoist story about a Chinese farmer that illustrates how a different context can change the meaning of an event. A farmer in a poor country village was considered very well-to-do because he owned a horse which he used for plowing and for transportation. One day his horse ran away. All his neighbors exclaimed how terrible this was. But the farmer simply said, "Maybe." A few days later, the horse returned and brought 2 wild horses with it. The neighbors all rejoiced at his good fortune, but the farmer just said, "Maybe." The next day, the farmer's son tried to ride one of the wild horses. The horse threw him and broke his leg. The neighbors all offered their sympathy for this misfortune, but the farmer again said, "Maybe." The next week, conscription officers came to the village to take young men for the army. They rejected the farmer's son because of his broken leg. When the neighbors told him how lucky he was, the farmer replied, "Maybe." The NLP presupposition that every behavior is useful in some context is a general statement that alerts us to think of context. When a client is unhappy about some behaviors of theirs, a very useful first step is to point out the context in which that behavior would be totally appropriate and beneficial. For instance, let's say a father is unhappy about repeatedly losing his temper and yelling at his kids about small matters like lateness or a messy room, pointing out that yelling could be very useful in getting their attention. In a situation in which they are in real and immediate danger, can reduce his self-criticism and change his orientation from opposing and stopping the yelling to redirecting it and choosing the appropriate context for it. Yell in this context, not that one. Yell in this context, comma, not that one. It is much easier to redirect behavior than it is to stop it. And seeing the value of it in one context makes it easier to find a different behavior in the context where it is a problem. Since every event has both sequential and simultaneous aspects, and every event occurs in some context, these three different categories of meaning are not strictly independent or separable. They are different ways that someone can understand the same experience by attending to different aspects of it. For instance, the statement, "Because of this reckless driving he will get into an accident," could link a short movie of a careening car with an image of a car wreck sequentially. Or the two images could be still pictures side by side, linked simultaneously in space, or one of the images could be inside the other, with the outside one providing the background. In the same way, any equivalence, X means Y, can be rephrased as X causes me to think Y. That kind of look makes me think that he considers me a wimp. Wimpness could also be represented in the figure-ground contrast between an image of myself in surrounding context of a group of very studly men. I am too quiet in a particular context could also be represented by the sequential consequences of being quiet, being ignored or abandoned, or by simultaneous adjacent image of being rejected or ridiculed. I'm too quiet in particular context could also be represented by the sequential consequences of being quiet, being ignored or abandoned, or by simultaneous adjacent image of being rejected or ridiculed. In any situation, we can attend primarily to any one of these three ways of creating meaning, or more likely any two of them, or even all three. X causes, cause-effect. X is, equivalence. X in, context. X causes Y, X is Y, X in Y. Cause-effect, equivalence, context. These three different categories of meaning indicate the scope of what someone is attending to, and they also indicate the scope of what they are not attending